Yes, as we explore Fort Donaldson historical battlefield, this was a battlefield that pretty much was a pivoting point of the American Civil War. This battle happened between February 14th to the 16th in 1862. This is the place where General Ulysses S. Grant became a household name, earned him his second star, and pretty much opened the South and especially Tennessee to the Union Army. This was a pivotal battle in the American Civil War that I don't know if a lot of people really understand the importance of or even have heard of the Battle of Fort Donelson. So join us as we explore Fort Donelson. This is the view of Fort Donelson from the other side of the Cumberland River. As you can see behind me, and we'll get better images, of the defensive emplacements of the artillery battery that was to face off on the flotilla of ironclads that were going to come down the Cumberland River here. So in a moment, we'll take you to a real look at Fort Donelson. It's the morning of February 14th. Looking down the river here, we're looking for 4 ironclad steamships approaching with the Union Navy. Coming down around this bend, there are Union troops landing. 13 miles to the east is Fort Henry that has fallen on February 6th. General Grant and his army are going overland. There was some unseasonably warm weather though those few days between, so the Union Army was dropping blankets and heavy coats along the way because of the weight. The weather turned and became drastically different. So the Confederate batteries here and behind me, or would be behind the camera, were on the top hill, but they were moved down here. The advantage of the artillery here versus at Fort Henry, and why Fort Henry fell so fast, is because it was pretty much level with the river. Whereas here, these artillery pieces had the height advantage. We're about 150 feet above the river. They could shoot down on top of the Union ironclads, which didn't have iron plating on the roof. So the battle that took place on this river was actually a Confederate victory. The importance of this post in this river is that this was considered the gateway to the South. If they could control the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers, you controlled the Mississippi and the Ohio. You had a perfect gateway into the South. So the first initial contact between the Union and the Confederates was here on February 14th, and it was a Confederate victory. Landing is the original defensive position on one of the outer things. Fort Donelson is directly off camera. I'm facing it. This was the outside perimeter defense positions. You can see there was artillery here from the Virginia units. You can still see remains of the earthen trench works that the Confederates had built up in preparation of the Union attack. During the Battle of the 15th of February, when the Confederates did their breakout maneuver further to the south, Grant, rightfully so, determined that they must have weakened their defensive line somewhere along their defense perimeter to enhance the manpower needed to create that breakout. So he ordered General Smith and his companies to attack this area. With the defense of Brigadier General Buckner and the Virginia artillery, they were able to push back the Union soldiers, but only for a little bit of time. Eventually, by end of day, the Confederates had fallen back to the previous position and are now, this was in the control of the Union hands. As the Union was preparing to plan the further advance, this was in the late evening of February 15th, Brigadier General Buckner and the other Confederate generals had met to discuss what to do the next day. This is after the failed breakout attempts that initially would have happened if it hadn't been for some overconfidence, some misguided actions by a couple of the Confederate generals. So basically, what happens is by the morning of the 16th of February, this will now be a Union fort. Where I'm standing now is, you can see this fence here, which is a classic style from that time period. This is Buckner's last stand, if you will, or final defense. What happened was Colonel Buckner of the Confederacy was tasked with stopping the forward progress of the Union troops at this point. General Grant ordered Union troops to come up over this ridge and collapse the defenses of Fort Donaldson with the hope of a full-out surrender or capture of the fort. What had happened during this time period is that the other Confederate generals had decided to create a breakout, which we'll see in another location, and then withdraw all troops other than a handful to hold and delay the Union troops so they can march and survive, essentially, and go back to Nashville. As you'll see later, that didn't happen. Unfortunately, what happened is the Confederate breakout was so efficient, and it boistered, even in a false way, the Confederate generals' idea that they could win and defeat Grant here. So they collapsed back to their original defensive positions instead of holding that corridor and allowing the troops to flow out. And that would lead to the ultimate demise of the Confederate troops here at Fort Donaldson. Where I'm standing now is one of the final defensive positions. The trench works and the cannons behind me, but more importantly, this monument behind me, because the fallen Confederate soldiers were considered act treason or tyranny against the Union. They were not allowed to be buried in a cemetery, a military cemetery or a national cemetery that we showed you. They were put in a mass grave. It is believed to be here or near here. So the Daughters of the Confederacy in the 1930s had this monument created and placed here and dedicated to the fallen Confederate soldiers. It just shows that there's a loss on both sides, and that it has a lasting impression. So this is hallowed ground for those soldiers who died here. Here we are at one of the southernmost defensive positions of the Confederates at Fort Donaldson. Just to give you an idea of the scope of size of the defensive perimeter around the 540-acre fort itself, it was about 3 miles. It was not continuous. It was broken obviously by terrain and some other factors. But this was Graves Battery that was attempting to stop or slow the advance of the Union Army approaching from the south. As you can see, trees and everything have grown up, but if you think back or imagine what it would have been like in 1862, a lot of this was cleared out and you had clear fields of fire. So just as time marches on, it also takes over battlefields. Some of the trench work of the defensive trenches are still behind me and are surrounding us. After the collapse of the Confederate defenses, Graves Battery was moved to another location to assist on the attempted breakout. We are standing in the area of Brigadier General Pillow's original command. Under him and his troops, he had some brigades from the Virginia contingent as well. This was their original position. Eventually, General Pillow would collapse his defenses and go in support of the right flank to help with the breakout. But I want you to remember the name Pillow, because it will play a pivotal role in the final outcome of Fort Donaldson. I'm standing here at the final battle position of Fort Donaldson. It was here that Pillows, Floyd, Johnston, and Buckner put up their last defense and tried to do their breakout. But more importantly, I wanted to highlight that this was not just a state versus state. This was the Union versus the Confederacy. And in the Confederacy, just like in the Union, there were multiple states represented here in this battle at Fort Donaldson. You had Tennesseans, obviously, Mississippians, Virginians, and you had Texans, you had Kentuckians, because even though Kentucky was pretty much a neutral state, there was the battalions or brigades that went to either side, either the Union or the Confederacy. But the Texans came here to fight, and this monument is dedicated to those who came here to fight and eventually lost their lives. Currently, we are standing in front of the National Cemetery here at Fort Donelson. This site was originally the second site of Fort Donaldson that was built by the Union troops in 1863. Afterwards, in approximately 1867, this became the National Cemetery here at the former site of Fort Donaldson. It is no longer an active cemetery, but it's as far as taking new internments, but it is a registered historical place. And behind me is the house that was built for the original cemetery keeper back in the late 1800s. And it was occupied till about 1936. The only troops buried here are Union troops and military members of wars after the American Civil War. The Confederate troops, because of the stance of the United States and the Union at the time, were not allowed to be interned here. They are actually buried elsewhere on the Fort Donelson site. We are here at the Dover Hotel, or as it's most commonly known as the Surrender House. This is our final stop on the battlefield tour of Fort Donelson. It was at this building that General Grant would take the surrender of the Confederates defenders of Fort Donelson. But more importantly, the story should be told that the night of the 15th of February, 1862, the Confederate generals of Floyd, Pillow, Buckner, and Lieutenant Colonel Forrest, a cavalry genius, met to determine how to best defend and push back the Union troops. It was at this meeting that, against the arguments of Forrest and Buckner, Brigadier General Pillow and Brigadier General Floyd felt that there was no surviving. And essentially, they were, in all accounts, were worried about saving their own skin and didn't want to become prisoners. So they decided they were going to withdraw with whatever troops they could take, and they took very little because the boats that they acquired to cross the Cumberland River at that time of year were small and could not hold a lot of personnel. So that led General Buckner to be the only defender of Fort Donelson, because during this conversation, Lieutenant Colonel Forrest became so disgusted with the conversation, he said, "I'd rather continue the fight and retreat than surrender." So he took about 2,000 personnel with him and found their way across the Cumberland River through the ice and water. This left General Buckner. During that night, after it was decided what was going to happen, General Buckner, being a classmate of General Grant, wrote and asked for conditions of surrender. General Grant responded, "There will be unconditional surrender and no terms." When this returned back to General Buckner, he was very upset. He found it unchivalrous, ungentlemanlike. But he knew at this point he had no choice. So on the morning of the 16th of February, 1862, General Grant and his leadership arrived here at the Dover Hotel and met with Brigadier General Buckner and accepted the surrender of the Confederate troops stationed here at Fort Donelson. It should be noted that General Buckner and Grant later said, while his response was unchivalrous, they actually had a very amicable meeting, and General Grant allowed him to keep his sword and allowed the officers of the Confederacy to keep their sidearms. The final outcome was that the Union now possessed the waterways of Tennessee, of the Tennessee River and Cumberland, which pretty much opened up the South. They also lost 13,000 troops. Another division of Confederate troops had arrived during the evening of the 15th. They never even got to fire one shot. The next day, they were prisoners of war. 13,000 troops pretty much milled in this area under Union guard until steamboats came and took them up the river to prisoner of war camps in Chicago and elsewhere, dramatically weakening the strength of the Confederates and basically a pivotal point in the American Civil War. General Grant became a household name. The U.S., which is actually Ulysses S. Grant, became known as Unconditional Surrender Grant. This led him to get his second star and put him in households everywhere and would lead to him becoming the president eventually. And to close this out, so I want to say thank you for everything you do, and please let us know if you like this. My name is Bill. You've been watching Sitrep Podcast, coverage of Fort Donelson. You have a great day.